I miss it.
Yeah.
I want, as a father, please enjoy
Yeah.
as much as you possibly can, because pretty soon, just bring the pizza and get out. I have a 13. Can we just get the pizza and you go?
Oh,
it's like, well, we're
man.
gonna watch a movie. I'm gonna watch my own movie.
Oh, man.
Get the pizza and go. So please enjoy it. But what does family mean for this journey that you're on? You know, right now you have a wife, and I from talking to you and listening, I guess
Yeah.
she's a professional modern woman out doing, having her life, and then she comes home and you're there
Yeah.
with pizza, broccoli, kids, dance party, and everything else. What does family mean to you?
It's everything. I mean, it is the thing that has grounded me, the thing that it has expanded my empathic muscles, and made me more cognizant of things and paid more attention to things in the world that I might not have paid attention to before. But it also, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about kind of what you just alluded to, how quick it is, right? And it's, my kids are 6 and 4, and so we kind of like have aged out of the toddler phase, and that was hard, man. It was hard. Like there's the age 0 to 4 is like a very special time because you're watching your kids discover the world for the first time, and there's so much awe, right? Like my kid will see a butterfly and be like, "Oh my God!" Like I remember when my kids saw a ladybug for the first time. It was during COVID, and there was like a weird like ladybug infestation in my office. Like, and so like I'm standing on a chair like trying to swat the ladybugs, and my son comes in and he's like, "Dad," he's maybe like 3 at this point. He was like looking at the ladybugs flying around. He was like, "Dad, have you ever really looked at a ladybug?" And meanwhile, I'm like with a newspaper, like trying to, and I'm like, "Huh?" And then I kind of just like slowly, I got down and I just...
You remembered you were a writer.
Right. And then I was like, I don't know. I mean, and then we sat there and we like just kind of, one flew onto my finger and we kind of just like looked at, and it's just these moments that, for me, the best part of it was that I was rediscovering how remarkable the world is through the eyes of my kids. And I think especially in a moment, this was happening during COVID and January 6th and all the Trump and all this. And there was so much catastrophe everywhere. And it was the best thing my kids did for me was to remind me that amid all the catastrophe, there's also so much to be grateful for. There's so much beauty. There's so much. And, we talk about simultaneity. And like having toddlers, when COVID started, I had a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and it was hard. It was difficult. It was inelegant. And I think that,
to put it, what a word.
This man said inelegant.
It was inelegant. It was messy. It was messy.
Yes.
But but now we're aging into like a different period. There's like extracurriculars. This morning we had like my son's soccer game and then my daughter's gymnastics, and my wife was like, "I'm going to brunch." And I was like, okay.
That's her
extracurricular. And so, but it's fun. Like, it's fun. Like my son is obsessed with soccer now, and like that's the sport I played growing up. And so to be able to share that, and I try to I say all this to say that like, I think about them being 6 and 4 now. And I'm like, man, that was like that. And like in that same period of time, I'll have a 12-year-old, right? Who, and hopefully they still want to kick it with you, but like, I don't know. And for me, the last year or so, I've really tried to remind myself, even amid the difficult moments, how fleeting this period of time is, where your kids are young and just like love you and want to hug you, and just like you are the center of their universe. And so I do my best to be present for it. And I think it took me a little while to get there, because I think I was so focused on my work and my writing, and but I think for me, I now have a better sense of like what my relationship to work should be and what my relationship to my family should be, and how to fit that all together.
I love it. It sounds like you're a modern dad. A lot of it, I'm a modern dad. Some of the traditional things that we saw men do, we had to throw out the window. Come home. You can't stay at the office.
Yeah.
You got to come home. And Saturday morning, you have things to do with the kids, and She's leaving.
Yeah. And even thinking
And
about
you're going to be here with the kid.
and even the idea that doing that should, like, I have a poem in the book called Gold Stars. And it's about this idea that, like, all right, my wife is like going to her friend's brunch for her birthday. And then I'm gonna take the kids for the day and do, you know, all the stuff. And the idea, the feeling that can seep into even the best of us, they're like, you know, like somebody should pat me on the back for this. Like I'm there, you know, like somebody, and it's interesting how ubiquitous like that feeling is. Like I'll be walking down, I remember when I was walking down the street and my kids were a little younger, and like walking down the street, my daughter was in the little carry-on thing. I was holding my son's hand.
Hold on, did you had your daughter in the Bjorn?
I was holding her
baby
Bjorn.
Okay.
Yeah, and walking down the street.
Modern, huh?
And somebody like we were walking on the side street, somebody rolled down their window and was like, I see you, Father of the Year out here. You the man, you know, and that kind of thing happened often.
With me.
Yeah, there you go. and it's interesting because I both appreciate it. I appreciate the sentiment deeply. Especially when it's coming from other Black folks, right? Because there's something, you know, so much of the caricature of Black fatherhood is that we're absent, that we're not attentive, that we're not sensitive or you know, affectionate with our kids and all this stuff. At the same time, no one would ever stop and do that for my wife. No one would ever roll down the window and be like, you're an incredible mother. Nobody would, you know, I walk into CVS holding my kids and people come up to me and like, you're such a good dad. This is incredible.
Like you're in the military.
Like thank you for your truly. And it's just like, and people hold the door for you. People are like, do you want some candy? Like, can I give you flowers? And none of that ever happens for my wife. And so it's both a recognition, like I appreciate the moments in which people are like, wow, you're such a good dad. You're doing these things that like, you know, my dad or my granddad didn't do. And recognizing that you are doing things that women and mothers do all the time and never get thanked for and never get acknowledged. And I think it's just important to name, because otherwise you can get caught up in being like, wow, like I'm the best dad of all time. Like somebody should give me Biden should give me a Medal of Honor. But it's like you're doing what you're supposed to do, even if that wasn't happening in the generations prior.
Right, and that's the thing. I guess I'm glad you articulated that, because this is what we're supposed to do. Yeah. It's your family,
right?
So whatever it takes, and you're not getting high five. I mean, she's not getting high fived or whatever for walking through the door, whatever with the kids. However, when she's at brunch, they all high five.
Oh, they high five.
Right. Oh, I got out too.
Oh, yeah.
We are the.
No, I know. It was like 2:00. I was like, what time you coming back? She got home at 5:00. I was like, that was a long brunch.
It's new brunch.
Oh, new brunch, man.
It is new brunch, Clint.
I was like, I need to schedule some brunches.
You and I spoke in the back for a hot second, and I want to talk about being in Prince George's County and becoming a writer, because that's where I watched the only writer I know do it. There was what she explained to me was there was an elevated sense of what it means to be a writer in this area. That if you did the same thing other places, the community that you spoke about necessarily wasn't there. The sort of the infrastructure wasn't there. The agents don't look at that place, these other places, like they look at Washington, D.C. and Prince George's County, Montgomery County, and the rest. Can you speak for a second about why you got from New Orleans to our backyard?
Yeah, I mean, so I
love it here. I'm sorry. I'm born and raised.
Yeah.
And so I'm a huge, I try to pat us on the back every time I get a chance about how incredible Prince George's County is. And I just want to hear it from your perspective.
Yeah, I love Prince George's. And, you know, when I grew up in New Orleans, I went to Davidson College. I graduated. I lived in South Africa for a year doing public health work around HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis. And then I came back here and became a teacher in Prince George's County. So I was a teacher here for a few years. And just like, you know, I had heard a lot about it. I had a homeboy in college who grew up in Mitchellville.
Okay.
And I remember driving through Mitchellville. I'd be like, "Is this the Black Mecca? Like, what is it?" Like, "What are all these? Look at these Black people in these houses and these." And it was not. We didn't have that in New Orleans, right? Like there was not a sort of such a strong contingent of middle and upper middle class Black folks as exists here. And obviously, the county is diverse, and the county, there's a lot of economic diversity. There's a lot of, even within all the Black folks here, like a lot of diversity within the Black community. Like so many of my students that I taught at Parkdale were the children of West African immigrants. There were a lot of Middle Eastern immigrants. There were a lot of people from the Caribbean. And so, I think one of the things that I love and appreciate about this place is that even if somebody's looking from 30,000 feet up, it might look very homogenous. It might look like everybody's the same. But there's so much diversity of thought, diversity of ideas, diversity of experiences within the county that was really moving to me. And that's the kind of things that I want. That's why we stayed in Maryland. My wife works is a law professor at Georgetown, and we just kind of fell in love with the community. It both, and it exists in different ways in Montgomery County and Prince George's County, but we kind of, because we have so many friends who like live in the various counties, we find ourselves coming out here pretty often. And so it's a special place, and a place that I think is known, primarily for being this, known for different things, but I came to know it as like, oh, it's like the wealthiest Black county per capita in the country. But I think that only tells like a part of the story about the folks here, who is it's a really special community.
Very much so. Thanks, man. We talked backstage, and you wanted to speak on a couple of places that you visited when you were making this new piece. Speak to us, because I've always heard about Angola. Speak to us about how Angola impacted you, and now how it impacts what you're putting out.
Yeah, so Angola, for those who might not be familiar, is the largest maximum security prison in the country. 18,000 acres wide, bigger than the island of Manhattan. It's a place where 75% of the people held there are Black men. Over 70% of them are serving life sentences. And it is built on top of a former plantation. And I went to Germany a year or two ago. I was writing a story for The Atlantic on how Germany memorializes the Holocaust.
Okay.
And I went to the Dachau concentration camp, the first concentration camp that the Nazis built in Germany. And I had never been to a concentration camp. I stepped in there, and it's this vast, haunting expanse of empty gray land. You look to your left, you see the remnants of the crematorium, and you look to your right, you see the skeletons of these barracks where, thousands of people were packed in like animals. And I just tried to do this thought exercise. I kind of closed my eyes, and I was like, what would it be like if on this land they built a prison, and in that prison, the vast majority of the people held there were Jewish? And it was so viscerally upsetting that I couldn't even finish the thought exercise, because it was abhorrent to imagine. Like, I could never imagine that in Germany, they would build a prison on a former concentration camp, and that the people in the prison would be disproportionately Jewish. And yet, here in the United States, we have the largest maximum security prison in the country, where the vast majority of people are Black men serving life sentences, many of whom were sentenced as children, given that the United States is the only country in the world that sentences children to life without the possibility of parole, many of whom were sentenced by non-unanimous juries, which has since been rendered unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States for being an explicit vestige of white supremacy, who pick crops for pennies on the hour while someone watches over them on horseback with guns over their shoulder. And so part of what I was thinking today, right now, and so part of what I was thinking about when I went to Angola is like, well, what is it? What are the specific manifestations of anti-Blackness that allow that place to exist in that way, on that land today, in a way that we would never allow to exist in a different geopolitical context? Like, we would never allow that the parallel to exist in Germany in that way, rightfully so. And so, the other thing about Angola is I went in, and it's a place that has a gift shop. And in the Angola gift shop, you can buy coffee mugs, shot glasses, T-shirts, sweatshirts, baseball cap. You could buy a shirt that has the silhouette of a watchtower. And above and below the watchtower, it'll read Angola, a gated community. right? As if to make a mockery of or belittle the experiences of thousands of people, tens of thousands of people over time who have been incarcerated there. And I was there with a guy named Norris Henderson. And Norris served almost 30 years in Angola. Got out in 2003. He's now been just celebrated being out for 20 years. And he's one of the leaders in the sort of prison reform movement in Louisiana. And we were on this bus and we were leaving Angola, and on the out of the window, I saw these men who were working in fields. They were lifting their garden hose into the air and digging them into the earth, lifting their shovels into the air and digging them into the earth. And somebody was watching them on horseback with a sort of rifle laid across their lap. And I looked at Norris, and he was looking out the window, and then he looked at me, and he opened his hands. And his hands had these calluses on them from all these years he spent working in the field. And he was like, "Clint, I can't explain to you what it felt like to pick crops, to pick cotton for 7 cents an hour, and wonder if my own ancestors picked cotton on this same land 200 years ago." So for the people who are incarcerated in Angola, this history is not an abstraction. It's not a metaphor. It's something embedded in their bones, their consciousness, the calluses in their hands. And, so for me, so much of what I'm trying to make sense of is what allows that place to persist in that way, given what we know about it. And, it's as the scholar Celia Hartman talks about. She talks about this Columbia University scholar and historian who's written extensively about slavery. She'll talk about the afterlife of slavery and how, which is a phrase that is meant to convey the way that the history of slavery shapes our social, economic, political, and carceral infrastructure, and how, the remnants and the residue of that history is still very much a part of so many of our systems today in ways that are explicit and in ways that are more subtle. But I learned a lot about the ways that history is still present in the land that it took place on.
The Confederate cemetery.
Mm.
So Angola, then the Confederate cemetery. You visited there as well.
I did. I visited Blandford Cemetery, which is one of the largest Confederate cemeteries in the country, where the remains of 30,000 Confederate soldiers are buried. And I didn't think that I was going to write. I didn't write in my book proposal, like, I'm going to go visit a Confederate cemetery, because my wife would have been like, "No, you're not." And she'd been like, "Nope."
Yeah.
But I thought I was going to write this chapter on Civil War battlefields. So I went to Petersburg, Virginia. There's this massive Civil War battlefield there, and this sort of national park that, talks about the siege of Petersburg right before the end of the Civil War in 1865. And I was there, and I was telling the park ranger about my project. And he was like, "Oh, you should go visit this Confederate cemetery down the road." And it's almost like in the movies where they have like the angel and the devil appear on your shoulder, except it's like regular Clint and writer Clint. And so writer Clint is like, "Oh, we got to go to that Confederate cemetery down the road." And regular Clint is like, "We're absolutely not going to the Confederate cemetery down the road. There's no chance." But part of what I appreciate about being a writer is that it puts me in positions that I otherwise wouldn't put myself in. And so I was like, I got to go to the Confederate cemetery. And I went, and I ended up going on Memorial Day. And I spent the day with the Sons of Confederate Veterans on their Memorial Day celebration. And it was a strange experience, but it was also an incredibly clarifying experience, because it helped me understand that for so many people, history is not about primary source documents or empirical evidence. It's a story that they're told. It's a story that they tell. It's an heirloom that's passed down across generations. It's something where loyalty takes precedence over truth. I met a guy named Jeff, and Jeff had this long salt and pepper ponytail, this handlebar mustache, this round belly, this biker vest with Confederate paraphernalia all over it. And he was telling me about how when he was a kid, his granddad used to take him to the cemetery. And they would sit in this beautiful white gazebo at the center of the cemetery, surrounded by all these tombstones. And his grandfather would pull out his banjo and sing these old Dixie anthems. And he would tell him about the men who were buried in this soil and how these men weren't fighting a war over slavery. These men weren't racist. These men were just trying to protect their families. These men were just trying to, protect their culture. These men were trying to trying to protect themselves from the war of northern aggression and invasion. It was the Yankees who were coming to invade and try to sort of oppress and take over the South, and that's what they were fighting for. It had nothing to do with slavery and racism. And as he would tell them these stories, he would talk about how he watched the sun set beyond the trees and watched the sky turn from blue to orange to purple to black. How they watched the fireflies come out of the forest at night and hop from one tombstone to the next. Watch the deer come and graze around the tombstones. These really sentimental memories. And so the thing is, if I go to Jeff and I'm like, well, the other thing about Jeff is that he talks about how now he was like, now I bring my granddaughters to the cemetery and I sit in the same gazebo that my grandfather sat with me in. And I sing the same songs on my banjo that he sung to me, tell them the same stories about the men who were buried in this field that my grandfather told me. And so if I go to Jeff and I say, Jeff, look, man, I know your granddad told you that, slavery had nothing to do with the Civil War, or that, secession, the Southern states seceding from the Union had nothing to do with slavery. But all you have to do is look at the declarations of Confederate secession, the documents that the seceding states wrote for themselves in 1860 and 1861, where a state like Mississippi says very explicitly in the document, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. So they're not vague about why they're seceding from the Union. They're very clear about it. But if Jeff was to accept that information, he would have to accept that his grandfather was lying to him. And if he has to accept that his grandfather was lying to him, it threatens to disintegrate the foundation of a relationship he has with this man who he loves, with this man who represents an entire family, an entire community that is integral to his sense of self. And so suddenly, if I'm like, well, Jeff, we just need to reorient our understanding of American history. I'm not just asking Jeff to do a sort of simple reorientation. I'm asking Jeff to call into question the very essence of his identity and who he believes himself to be, right? It suddenly becomes an existential crisis, an existential question, where the stories that he has been told throughout his life by the people that he loves are being revealed to not be true. And that's hard for people, right? And I think that many people are willing to hold on to lies, even in the face of evidence that what they have been told is a lie, because if they accept the new reality, they accept the evidence before them, they would have to do a complete recalibration of self. And like if this story is not true, what is not true about me? My story that I've told about myself, the story my parents have told about who we are, the story about this community that I grew up in. It's like the one thread that you pull out from the blanket, and then the whole thing starts to unravel. And so I think there's a lot of people who prefer not to pull at that thread, even when they see it.
Yes, indeed. Monticello, you visited?
Yeah, Monticello is the first chapter of the book. I wanted to go to Monticello because I think that Thomas Jefferson, so Monticello, for those who might not be familiar, is the home of Thomas Jefferson.
My bad, Monticello. The home of Thomas Jefferson.
Home of Thomas Jefferson.
It's starting to impact with writing. Sorry, I didn't. I was getting.
No, somebody's sitting over here engrossed.
Yeah.
So please.
And Jefferson's an interesting historical figure for me because I think that he embodies the sort of cognitive dissonance of America, in the sense that America is a place that has provided unparalleled, unimaginable opportunities for millions of people across generations for upward mobility in ways that their own ancestors could have never imagined. It is also a place that has done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed. And both of those things are the story of America. It's not one over here and one over there. You could talk about this one and not talk about that one. America is both of those things. And I think that Jefferson is almost a sort of like microcosm of that tension, because he is someone who wrote one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world, and also someone who enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children. He's someone who wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, and wrote in Notes on the State of Virginia that Black people were inferior to whites in both endowments of body and mind. Said the slave was incapable of love to the same extent their white counterparts were. The slave was incapable of possessing or sustaining complex emotion. Talked about Phyllis Wheatley, sort of mother of African American literature, the first Black woman to publish a book of poetry in the history of the United States. He said that her work was below the dignity of criticism, that it wasn't even worth engaging with because he didn't think that Black people could create art. He didn't think that Black people had the artistic, emotional acumen with which to create beautiful things. So he was like, we can call it something else, but we can't call it poetry because Black people don't possess the intellectual and emotional capacity with which to create art. And I think
while
about
he's
that
holding the art in his hand.
while he's holding it in his hand. And I think about that, and I think about how that's the version of Jefferson that I was never taught. And so for me, I wanted to go to Monticello because I was curious. So much of what this project is about is examining how these institutions, how these historical sites, how these monuments, memorials, what is the story that they're telling? Are they being honest? Are they being dishonest? How do they change and evolve with regard to how they tell the story? And I went to Monticello, and I went on this tour with a guy named David Thorson, older white guy, very professorial in his disposition. And he was giving this presentation on Jefferson. Because at Monticello, you can go on a main house tour, and then there's also the Slavery at Monticello tour, a sort of horticultural tour. He was a very dynamic person, and so there are lots of different tours that speak to different parts of his life and personality. But this was the Slavery at Monticello tour. And he was being very honest about like all of the things that so many of the things that I had just brought up. And I never heard the contradictions about Jefferson sort of laid out in the way that David laid them out. And I was on the tour with this group of about a dozen people, but there were these two white women who I was watching as the conversation was happening. And they're sort of, as David was outlining, so much of Jefferson's hypocrisy. Their faces became flushed, their mouths sort of hung open. They were clearly very impacted by what was being said. And I remember I went up to them after, and I was like, I'd love to hear more about how you were affected by some of what David was saying. It seems like you were really impacted by it. And this one woman, Grace and Donna, and Grace looked at me and she was just like, man, he really took the shine off the guy. She was like, I had no idea Jefferson owned slaves. I had no idea Monticello was a plantation. And mind you, these are folks who bought plane tickets, rented cars, got hotel rooms, who came to this site as a sort of pilgrimage to see the home of one of our founding fathers, and yet had no idea that he was an enslaver. And for me, that was such an important moment because it was a reminder there, similar to, in a different way, but similar to the Confederate cemetery, that there are still millions of people across this country, even amid everything that has happened the last several years in this country, and the sort of shifting consciousness that I think has happened for millions of people who are more aware of things that they weren't aware of years ago. But there are still so many people who don't understand slavery's relationship to our founding fathers, that 12 of our first 18 presidents owned enslaved people, that the story of Black exploitation, the story of Black oppression is so integral to the story of this country's birth and origin. To the point where you could show up at Thomas Jefferson's home, right, to visit and be shocked to learn that he owned people. Yeah.
Wow. Deep, man. That is you're making an impact on me right now.